You're listening to the Kingdom Project Podcast. These are discussions on biblical theology and interpretation. The emphasis is on context and grace. The goal is to promote biblical literacy by displacing and debunking most modern interpretations. The challenge is to engage in healthy conversation that may stretch but sharpen iron. This is the Kingdom Project, and I'm your host, Marcus Hall.
All right, so turn to Romans chapter 4. We went into that last week. So that's what we'll be looking at 9 through 17 this morning. Romans 4, 9 through 17. So Paul has said in the chapter 3 that God's plan of salvation was witnessed in the law and the prophets, and he's shown that to be true. He gave those examples. Now, Paul moves now to exploring another point from his summary in chapter 3. That this salvation is for man. There's no distinction between Jew and Gentile. So it deals with the single questions. Who are the children of Abraham, right? So is it the circumcised or the uncircumcised? So we'll look at verses 9 through 12 first. It says, is this blessing then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So we can see it's like what he's already said, right? It's the faith. Abraham was counted righteous. He had it credited to him, imputed to him, before the law, and now we see it's before circumcision. And we know circumcision is like the Jewish birth certificate, all right? It was the basis for identity. It's the basis for Jewish identity and the sign of belonging to the Abrahamic covenant, all right? So every boy born in the family of Israel, they were circumcised or was to be circumcised at the age of 8 days old. Now, we know women aren't, of course, but they are included under the sign through the association with the male authority of their family. So a daughter was covered by the sign of her father. And then when the girl would marry, she's covered then by the sign of her husband. Okay, so therefore circumcision is this key distinction between Jews and Gentiles. So Paul asks in verse 9, is this blessing then only for the circumcised or the uncircumcised as well? And he asks because the blessing that David pronounced, in which we've already seen from Psalm 32, and Paul quoted in verses 7 and 8, it was understood by the Jews as applying only to them, only to the circumcised. So Paul quotes Genesis 15:6 and says faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. He is trying to, really make this point. So the Jew thought that God accepted him because he was circumcised, but Paul makes it clear by pointing to that Genesis account that God accepted him before he was circumcised. Verse 11 says that Abraham is the father of the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, and then in the next verse he says he's the father of the circumcised, the Jews as well. He switches the priority of salvation or salvific history to emphasize the inclusion of the Gentiles into Abraham's family. So Paul says that circumcision is a sign and a seal of what? Righteousness. And you notice what Genesis says. In Genesis 17:11 it says, "And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you." And Paul says it's a sign of righteousness. It was never intended to be the means of righteousness, but a sign of it. So look at verse 12 again. It says, "And to make him the father of the circumcised who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised." In other words, the Jews can indeed call Abraham their father, but only as long as they share in his faith. That's it. It doesn't matter about the bloodline. It doesn't matter that they're descendants or they're circumcised or any of these other things. You can call Abraham your father, rightly so, on the basis of faith. Paul is saying Jews must follow then in the footsteps of the uncircumcised Abraham, not the circumcised, which is very shocking to them. It's very absurd almost to them. All right? So that leads to this important distinction, all right? And it's a distinction between the Abrahamic covenant and the new covenant. The Abrahamic covenant promised the blessing of Jewish identity for those born into the line of Abraham, right? Jews entered into that covenant by birth into the physical line of him. And then the mark of circumcision then is the sign of that relationship. But that covenant does not automatically convey the spiritual blessings Abraham received by faith in God's promises. All right? So the 8-day-old Jewish boy is included in this covenant, but that child is not credited with the righteousness as Abraham received. It's only if that child repeats the faith of Abraham will he receive the credit of righteousness. So the Abrahamic covenant was not a means of salvation, though it implies the coming of the new covenant in which only the one who believes as Abraham did in the promises of God will be credited with righteousness of Abraham. So, in other words, if you're not following, your child is not automatically saved and a Christian because he's born to you as a Christian, right? He has to become a Christian the same way everybody else does, through faith. And God draws him, gives him faith, he's regenerated, and so on. So if you put it in that context of, it's the same, but just to understand better, he's saying just because they were circumcised, that means nothing. That was a sign or a seal. It's not the means, right? So we have to remember that the Mosaic law, then, it mandated circumcision. And the fact suggested to some Jews that the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant were to be obtained through the law. And that was the argument that was being made in the first century by the Judaizers. One must enter the law to receive the blessings of the new covenant. So then this leads Paul to give further argument then in verses 13 and 15. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null in promise, and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, But where there is no law, there is no transgression. So once again, Abraham was justified, not by anything he did, right? It's not any ritual, no law keeping. He's justified because he believed the promise of God. So now the promise to Abraham refers to the Abrahamic covenant. The law refers to the Mosaic covenant. So the Abrahamic covenant was a one-way grant where the blessings were given as a promise based on faith. Mosaic covenant was a two-way agreement where the blessings were earned by performance of works, right? The Abrahamic covenant is a greater person coming to a lesser and saying, "It's all, I do it all," right? In this covenant that God spoke to Abraham, He made promises to both Abraham and his descendants. And in the Mosaic covenant, the Lord made an agreement to Israel. And so the question is, who are the heirs of the covenant that God spoke to Abraham then? And to this, Paul says plainly in verse 13 that God promises to Abraham were to be obtained in the way that he obtained them, by faith alone. It's not by the law, it's by faith. So in Genesis, God promised Abraham that his descendants would be heirs of the world. God made this grant to Abraham, and it was a grant of land and prosperity. And the Lord said that this blessing would be Abraham's inheritance. And like any inheritance, Abraham would pass that on to his descendants. Now, earlier, Paul taught that Abraham's descendants were those who share in his faith. So the connection between Abraham and his heirs is spiritual. It's not physical. It's spiritual. Abraham received the promises when he put his faith in it. And after Abraham believed God, God established his promise as a covenant. So it's only those who belong to Christ who are Abraham's descendants. Abraham's only descendants are those of faith. All right? So if you are an heir, you have a legal right to an inheritance. Since we are Christians, we are now members of God's family, we have a right to all that God has promised to his children. And you can get in all the other things in there. Dispensationalists would like to argue and stuff about the land and Israel and stuff like that, and it's in there. They had already received that as well. But this is spiritual because it's by faith, all right? So Paul will use the same arguments in verses 14 and 15 that he's used in Galatians in 3:17, and which says, what I am saying is this: the law, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God so as to nullify the promise. All right, so 430 years after Abraham was given this covenant, an additional arrangement was then instituted by God. And this time God made an agreement, not a promise. It was an agreement with Israel. And the agreement demanded certain responsibilities of each party within this agreement. There were consequences involved. Each side had to uphold its part. But that agreement was not made at a much later time than the promise that was given to Abraham. Thus, it could have no effect on that promise. Okay? Get it? The promise and the agreement cannot be mixed together with one another because they accomplish different results. That's what he's saying. So, you have to know about covenants a lot probably to register all of this, but trying to make it simplistic as I can. So the fact that the law came later did not invalidate the life-giving promises that were originally established. So if you can achieve righteousness through morality, then faith is made void. That's what he's saying. The word means that faith becomes meaningless and it becomes empty. Simply put, Paul is saying here, if those blessings were later incorporated into a covenant of works, which was the law, then they would no longer be on the basis of a promise. In verse 15, Paul says that the law always brings about wrath, and he means that laws are cause for accusation. They don't always make us do the right thing. Rather, they expose us when we fail to live by them. But when no law exists, there can be no violation, Paul says. Without law, there can be no violation, and without violation, there is nothing standing in the way of blessing. That's the difference between works and grace. All right, so God only asked Abraham to believe, right, and believe in the promise. And on that basis, the promise was assured. And from that point forward, nothing could stop it from coming to Abraham because its fulfillment wasn't connected to his behavior. So there was sin before the Mosaic law, we know this, but it was not transgression because the law had not yet been given or written. Now, when the law was written, it turned sin into transgression, which is disobedience of the law. And in turning sin into transgression, then it worked wrath. So if we can achieve righteousness through the law, then we can boast before God of how we did not need him or his provision of righteousness through Christ alone. But nobody has ever achieved righteousness by the law. No one ever will, right? We enter into a covenant relationship, righteousness covenant with God, or into one that's established between God and Christ. We're put into that by faith alone. No work, no ceremony, ritual, sacrament, or anything like that will ever make man right with God. And that's his point. 16 and 17. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring. Not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. So, what is it that guarantees the promise that you will be an heir? And the answer is God's grace, right? The only way our eternal future is guaranteed is if it rests on God's grace. Grace is free. It's undeserved work that comes from God, and he brings his people to glory. So Paul means, for all the reasons that he's covered in this chapter up to this point, that the first reason is the blessing must be by grace, not by works, because righteousness is credited, not earned. Secondly, it's apart from the Jewish identity. It's apart from circumcision so that it could be available to both Jews and Gentiles. If Jewish identity were part of the whole process of salvation, then it would only be available to those who were Jewish. And it was always God's plan to have this single worldwide family, a single seed, a Messiah, and his people. And again, it goes back to Galatians, right? To Abraham and his seed, which was Christ. Abraham is the father of all who believe. It's not just the Jews, but Gentiles also. And in verse 17, it's quoting Genesis 17:5. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. So Abraham, he was promised to be a father of many nations, meaning that many would be spiritual heirs of that man for following his example, having faith. All right, so finally, God's blessing must be by faith and a promise. It's not by law, because otherwise no one could have ever expected to receive the blessing. God is the one who gives life to the dead, right? Calls into being that which does not exist. In Abraham's case, Paul is describing here Isaac, all right? From calling him from the dead womb. But the statement has a double meaning too, because it refers to the bringing of new life to a spiritually dead person. So calling into existence a faith and trust in God that previously did not exist. And this is how Abraham stands as ultimate proof for the manner of salvation, that he is our example of how a person can be led to faith in a promise from God. All right? So next week then, Paul will analyze Abraham's faith and go into greater detail.